Welcome to the show. Tonight, a warning to the Albanese government. Yet another government-backed green energy company crashes, just as Anthony Albanese plans to bet billions more on others. Also tonight, why this imam's response to the latest Islamist terror attack is so wrong.
This outdated game of expecting Muslims to condemn and to apologise.
Plus, yet more illegal boat people have landed in Australia. What is going on with our immigration and border controls? And outing the academics spreading anti-Israel propaganda. We'll also get the latest on Israel's new attack on Gaza. And Donald Trump dares a judge to jail him for criticising his very political trial. But first, I'm now seriously alarmed by the Prime Minister's response to China's attack on one of our Navy helicopters on the weekend. It's so weak that it's actually a national security problem. Anthony Albanese is effectively telling China, you can push us around, we won't fight back. And to a bully like Communist China, that's an invitation to go to war. On Saturday, China's Air Force dumped flares in the path of one of our choppers in international waters in the Yellow Sea off South Korea. Could have been catastrophic, but this is all that Albanese said today about that.
We have made very strong representations at every level to China about this incident, which we regard as unprofessional and unacceptable. One of the things that had broken down over a period of time was any dialogue. And that's why we've used all of those avenues of communication to make our position on this incident very clear.
That attack by China was just an incident, and it was unprofessional. I mean, what nonsense. It makes it sound like an accident. No, this was a very professional and deliberate attempt by China to intimidate us and to test us. It's China telling us it rules everywhere, even in international waters. It can bully us. And what are you going to do about it? And that answer from Albanese today is, well, next to nothing. Yes, as he said, is lodged formal protests with someone or other, wouldn't say who. But there are three things he didn't do. One, he didn't call this out for what it was, an attack on our armed forces. And not the first either, by the way. Last year, China injured some of our Navy divers from the HMS Toowoomba, again in international waters, by letting off a sonic pulse while they were in the water clearing a propeller. And Albanese then reacted just like he's done today, refused to complain directly to Chinese dictator Xi Jinping, even when the two men met at an APEC meeting just a few days later, where Albanese seemed to act like a puppy desperate for a pat from its master. He refused to say whether he'd mentioned that attack on our divers to Xi, which means he almost certainly did not. And this time, exactly the same story. Albanese is refusing to ring dictator Xi directly, like he doesn't really want to upset the boss. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has called him out on that.
I think the Prime Minister needs to pick the phone up, frankly, and speak to the Chinese President, to President Xi, and express our deep concern, because at some stage there's going to be a miscalculation and an Australian Defence Force member is going to lose their life, and that is a tragic circumstance that has to be avoided at all costs.
So, failure one from this government, not calling this attack an attack. And failure two, not taking this to the top, confronting the dictator. And Albanese's third failure is not saying, well, you don't frighten us, China. In fact, you know what? We're going to double our patrols to show you we cannot be intimidated. Now, China's foreign ministry came up with a lying excuse an hour or so ago.
What truly happened was an Australian military aircraft deliberately flew within close range of China's airspace in a provocative move that endangers China's maritime and air security in the name of enforcing UN Security Council's resolution. The Chinese military took necessary measures at the scene to warn and alert the Australian side. The way the situation was handled was consistent with our law and regulations, professional and safe. China has lodged serious protests to the Australian side on its risky moves. We urge Australia to immediately stop the provocations and hypes to prevent misunderstanding and miscalculation.
What lying hounds. I mean, even what they say, we flew near China's airspace, not in it. Oh yeah, that's a sin. And in a threatening way. I mean, what's a threatening way? Like we're going to bomb China with a helicopter? I mean, come off it. What brazen liars these communist bullies are. But if you were dictator Xi Jinping, what would you now conclude from Albanese's reaction to all China's bullying and its bluster and its lying now? Well, it's obvious. You think, well, Albanese, he is weak. You think Albanese is desperate to be sweet with China, to look like the man who fixed the relationship that he claims the liberals broke. It's so desperate, in fact, that this guy's going to put up with almost anything. Now, if you think I'm being harsh, let me play again something Albanese said today that is just cringe-making. That boast of his, even after China kicked sand in his face, attacked their helicopter, that at least now we can talk about it with China like friends, not like under the liberals.
One of the things that had broken down over a period of time was any dialogue. Dialogue is important.
Well, whoopee-doo for this dialogue now. I mean, since China praised Albanese for going soft, called him handsome boy, allowed this dialogue now, look what it's actually done. It's attacked our military. It's launched hack attacks on us. It's had its foreign minister come here and insult Albanese by meeting with former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating, who in my opinion is ridiculously pro-Beijing, to reward him for attacking Albanese's government, as still too against China's dictatorship. And what dialogue is there really when the Prime Minister just mumbles about unprofessional conduct and an incident when our pilots could have been killed in a Chinese attack? But there's one thing I left out when I asked, what do you think China would conclude from Albanese's reaction, his fear of giving China offence? It's this, that Australia is so weak that come a war, China invading Taiwan, say, like it says it will, Australia under Albanese will probably do nothing. And that's a weakness that could invite the very war that Albanese fears, and just when he's leaving us too militarily weak to fight. Now, just briefly to something else that's dangerous, the state of Victoria. Now, this has become an economic basket case that could hurt us all. The Victorian government's budget today confirmed it. Even before today, Victoria was the state with the biggest and fastest rising debt, even though New South Wales has 22% more people. Now, that is debt caused by catastrophically bad management under a decade of Labor governments. Governments which hired massively more public servants and then made them Labor voters by bribing them with huge pay rises. But it's even worse than that, of course. This is a government so incompetent that it set a world record lockdown with Melbourne, an unnecessary one during the pandemic that's been financially devastating. It's also lost $600 million simply by bidding for the Commonwealth Games and then cancelling. It had major projects blow out. Just the North East Link is so far $10 billion over budget. It's also building a crazy rail loop linking suburbs in Melbourne that no one wants to visit to other suburbs no one wants to visit, which it first said would cost us $50 billion, now estimated to be heading to $200 billion, 4 times as much. Victoria spent, and it's spent. And even though its tax take has doubled under Labor, it's now ended up with the biggest debt of any state, now to be bigger than the debt of New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania all combined. And that means every Victorian man, woman and child today owes $54,000 in state and federal net debt, more than any other people in Australia. And Victoria's net debt is going to soar over the next 4 years by another $32 billion. And how's the state going to pay for it? How, when there's almost nothing left to sell? When its gas and electricity is running out thanks to its mad global warming policies? Has the penny dropped yet? Victoria is going to need some kind of bailout from the rest of the country, or it'll just crumble. Now, many Australians laughed at Victoria's woke stupidity for years, but idiocy has a price, and we're all about to pay it. And it's not going to be easy for the rest of the country either. The Reserve Bank Governor today said Australia's got some tough times still ahead. High inflation, high interest rates hanging around for a while yet, because the government's plan to swamp Australia with immigrants to boost the economy. Hey, big surprise, isn't working that well.
We must continue to be vigilant about the continued risk of high inflation. We believe we have rates at the right level to return inflation to the target range next year. But as we've said in the past, getting inflation back to target will take time. And I think the path will likely continue to be bumpy. Household consumption is very weak. And you can see that in the retail figures from last week. Growth is very subdued, even though population growth is strong.
Unbelievable. But let us now talk something much sunnier, because at least many of our federal politicians spent today having fun at one of the best things about Australia. They were at the Beef Week in Rockhampton to celebrate beef, raising cattle, eating beef, and having a beer or a red with it, while politicians went on Beef TV or did news crosses from Beef Week and shouted to journalists over all the mooing.
Reserve Bank will only respond to government settings. And as the Reserve Bank Governor has pointed out, Australia has a homegrown inflation problem. We're not seeing the extent of inflation in other comparable countries that we're seeing in Australia, and that's because of the policies that have been implemented by the Albanese government.
That's the politics I like. Keeping it real, up to your knees in dung, battling the livestock while thinking about our future. One of the other of the many politicians at Beef Week was, of course, our Tuesday regular, National Senator Matt Canavan, the former Resources Minister. Matt Canavan, thank you for your time. What was the mood of the meeting?
Well, look, mates, it's been great up here in Rockhampton. I mean, who really could be against a beef, against red meat? There are some, of course. There are some. The CSIRO a few years ago reckons that we're all going to eat bugs sometime soon, but I don't think Beef Week is ever going to really change into Bugs Week, at least in my lifetime. I think people love their meat, they love red meat, and they love our beef industry. So it's been fantastic here. I mean, the only downside, I think, is that we've got a Labor government. Lots of them have come here. The Prime Minister, the Agriculture Minister was here. And, of course, there's a lot of naturally occurring BS here. There's a lot of cattle, and then those Labor politicians coming here and adding to that BS, particularly BS around the idea that we should blanket our beautiful rural cattle country here in central Queensland with wind factories and solar factories. It's destroying our natural environment, destroying our productivity in the beef industry. And we've also had the Agriculture Minister. He came up here and his first thing he said was, isn't it great that the beef industry has cut its emissions by 78%? He didn't say what great steak they produce, what great exports they produce for our country. He's all talking about this mythical reduction in carbon emissions, which, by the way, has all come about in the cattle industry, or almost all of it's come about, because governments have stopped farmers from developing their own land. They've passed laws that have stripped their property rights off them to stop them clearing their own land, and that, through these ridiculous carbon calculations we have, gives them a carbon credit. And then they want thanks. The politicians want thanks from the cattle industry that they've stripped the property rights off. It is a total load of BS.
Well, I should have seen that BS line coming a mile off. Oh, how naive I am. But since you mentioned global warming, since you mentioned bull dung, I saw the Prime Minister spread some of it himself. He was there boasting he was giving farmers more drought relief, which is always welcome to a farmer, because droughts, he said, are becoming more severe with climate change. Now, Matt, I've actually checked Australia's rainfall data at the Bureau of Meteorology website. I can't see any evidence at all of more droughts getting worse. Why is he making things up like that?
Because he has a political agenda to sell. He's not here, obviously not here to support in good faith the agricultural sector. He's here to try and use this as a platform to use the cattle industry to push his own political agenda, which, as you say, is one tied to radical scaremongering on the climate. You're absolutely right that every time we've been told that somehow climate change is going to destroy our ability to grow food in the Murray-Darling, it's going to make it a dust bowl, all of this stuff has been said, and it's always been proven to be wrong. It's often said in the middle of droughts. In the middle of droughts, there's always a new emphasis that this time is different, that this drought's never going to end now. And when you talk to the local farmers during those periods, they all know they've seen this before. It does happen. It's terrible when it happens. And as you say, I'd always welcome more relief for people doing it tough during drought. But the droughts break. They always do, always have. And governments are doing the industry a disservice by continuing to propagate these lies. They're total lies that somehow the agricultural industry in this country is not going to be productive in the future because of the climate. It's just not consistent with the data.
Well, more worrying though, Matt, is that the Albanese government says it's going to be investing billions of dollars more of our money in green energy companies under its new Future Made in Australia plan. Apparently there's going to be a big reveal on budget night on next week. But this is when yet another, and I've had so many examples in the past, here's another one now, yet another government-backed green business has crashed. It's called Redback. It was selling batteries made in China. Crashed despite $2 million from the Queensland government, $2 million from Energy Queensland, and $7 million from the federal government's Clean Energy Finance Corporation. What is the lesson here?
Well, the lesson is that government is not very good at picking winners. I mean, I'd much prefer our governments to just lower taxes. If you want to help business, if you want to attract investment, including investment in green investments, just lower the tax rate for businesses. And then let investors, let banks work out who's going to make the most money, who's got the lowest risks. That's the way to do these things. And in fact, as distortionary as, say, the Biden government's Inflation Reduction Act, that's typically how they do it in the US. They lower tax rates. Whereas this government has an addiction to just spending your money. They get, I suppose, some kind of thrill out of it by signing a big cheque. But ultimately, it often ends in tears, as it has in this case. And if I can just finish briefly on the issue here in Central Queensland that's worrying me the most, is the government now is planning to take fresh water from the Fitzroy River, send it to Gladstone, burn it and turn it into hydrogen or ammonia, some sort of hydrogen product. They burn the water to do that at high temperature, and then send that product to Korea and Japan. Why in God's name would we export fresh water from one of the driest continents on the earth? That's the Albanese future made in Australia. They're going to export our fresh water and they call it hydrogen. But what they're doing is taking H2O, our freshwater resources of this country, sending it overseas. We never see it again.
I need to do a whole program on that green hydrogen scam. I've been meaning to do it with you for a while. We might do that next week. We'll see. Matt Canavan, thanks for your time. After the break, this, yes, is really Australia. In civil war in all but name, and where is the government? Plus, a judge warns Donald Trump to shut up or go to jail. It's not just Alice Springs. If we saw in a white community the gang violence now at Daly River, it's about 3.5 hours drive out bush from Darwin, politicians, police, journalists would declare a national scandal, an emergency. There have been run-throughs there, terrorising the locals. About 5 houses burned, cars set on fire, a man with an arrow right through his body, shotguns fired, people injured as the locals fled for their lives.
Gun! Hey! Now bullet. Hey, gun! That person who that brother, Mike got gun, Mike. Mikey got gun, Mikey. Mikey got gun, Mikey. Mikey got gun, Delok. Mikey got gun, Delok.
Thanks to Liam Mendes and the Australian for that footage there. Now, police say all good. They've arrested now 5 men and a teenager. They're going to work on community detentions. 50 people have had to be relocated. But is that anything near enough? Joining me is Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, the Coalition spokesman on Indigenous Australians, also a senator from the Northern Territory. Senator Jacinta Price, thank you so much for joining me. What happened in this town?
The violence that's been occurring in the community has been something that's been ongoing. It's absolutely horrific, though, to learn of these new events. The fact that, you know, there's more crossbows used as weapons, knives, guns now, and you've got elders from the community out that way who have been fearful, who are looking to sue the territory government because of they're not taking care of their safety. I mean, they've been threatened with rape and violence and all kinds of horrific sort of behaviour. And it's completely and utterly unacceptable in any town or community in Australia in 2024.
Yeah, well, you say that, but, you know, this has been going on for a couple of years. People being hit with axes, shot with crossbows, peppered with shotguns. The whole thing's been happening for a couple of years at least. And I don't see much getting done. No politicians actually going in there and saying there's something fundamentally wrong. And not just in this town, but so many Aboriginal communities out bush. And it's not just Alice Springs. What is needed, do you think?
Well, see, Andrew, this is the double standards in this country. I mean, Australia's been witness to some of the most horrific violence that occurred in Westfield Bondi recently. There's been other stabbings around the country. And, you know, the expectation is that we absolutely quash this sort of behaviour. We jump on it straight away. I mean, we're looking at limiting access to knives. This crossbow violence has been taking place, as you've said, for some time now, but there's been no calls to limit access to crossbows. You know, there's been marches for violence against women. Again, the violence that these women have been confronted with is absolutely horrific, but we don't see the same sorts of reaction or marches when it comes to Indigenous people in remote communities. I mean, this is something obviously that I've been talking about for years that we need to get on top of, that we simply don't get on top of. We have leniency toward perpetrators, particularly in the Northern Territory. I mean, we're seeing it right across Australia now with the acceptance of violence, which seemingly is occurring across our society. But this kind of behaviour cannot continue in these remote communities. We can't keep, you know, some communities propped up when we're getting homes burnt down. You know, people's cars from Darwin are being stolen and driven out of this community and burnt down. We need to eradicate gang violence. Of course, we in the Coalition are introducing legislation to stop the boasting and the posting online on social media. And this is what we're seeing over and over again. And this is what is causing violence to continue to flare up in these communities as well. But it takes a holistic approach from many different angles to tackle this.
Well, you mentioned social media there, and this is something that struck me too, Jacinta. I noted how many people at this Daly River community were filming things on their smartphones. One of the locals said tensions between various clans or whatever was stirred up with Facebook posts as well. I mean, here we see people who are seeing the world and all its temptations. They have all the technology, but they're stuck in a remote town with next to no work and no future. That has to be a recipe for disaster, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely it is. You know, and this is why we can't have these double standards in Australia, where remote communities are treated like little socialist enclaves where everybody's dependent on welfare, where they're shut off from the rest of the world. If you're an outsider, you need a permit to travel to these communities, which only allows this sort of behaviour to fester, as far as I'm concerned. There is no opportunity in these places. You know, people need to be able to be employed, but there's generations now who have experienced simply being on welfare that they don't even know what it is to, you know, to have a job. They don't want a job, because why would they want a job when they can simply go on a welfare payment? I mean, I've been around to communities right throughout Australia now, and the thing that I keep hearing is that people want CDEP to come back, because the CDEP program apparently in these communities for them was a step toward getting into employment, was something that got people out of bed in the morning. It's no longer, you know, something that's viable or taking place, but there needs to absolutely be more opportunity in these communities. But look, the violence, I saw the video of the women beating another young woman. You know, when they talk about violence against women in remote communities, it's quite often women perpetrating this violence against other women. It's not just gendered violence that we're talking about. We're talking about, you know, domestic, family, interpersonal violence in remote communities. That simply looks like it just goes unchecked, while the rest of the country marches on gendered violence issues. This is unacceptable in Australia in 2024.
Well, ultimately, don't we have to be talking about ending welfare ghettos out bush and helping transition, particularly the young, into integrating them into rural communities, towns, cities later, maybe, where there is work, where there is education, where there is a future, and not leaving these hellholes out bush?
Look, absolutely. And this is the thing, right? The romanticism of the left that suggests that you need to be connected to culture and country that's going to rescue you. It's nonsense. Any successful Australian or Australian of Indigenous heritage, any successful individual has a job, has a roof over their head, is part of the capitalist world that they hate so much. But that is what success looks like. And Aboriginal people in remote communities, we've got to stop denying them access to this and the opportunity to become part of a modern world and get away from this romanticism of what those that don't live traditional culture think it's all about. And yes, if we can't give Aboriginal people in communities the opportunity to be job creators, wealth creators, have private home ownership and private property of their own, then we would seriously have to have conversations along those lines about the viability of some remote communities, I believe.
Well, I will be fascinated to see what you do when you get in government. Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks for having me.
West, and increasingly here, there seems to me a real worry that's growing fast. How our country is being changed by mass immigration. Is it for the worse? Now, in Ireland, for instance, Dublin yesterday, there were a big demonstration of people protesting against the mass immigration that's brought them more crime, more people on social welfare, and a shortage of housing, like here. So US President Joe Biden said something on the weekend that struck me as particularly stupid, given all that, given the anxieties today about Islamic terrorism, for instance, here as well, the massive and hostile anti-Israel protests, or ethnic crime gangs like the Violent Brothers for Life, Middle Eastern crime gangs said last week, to spread from Sydney to Melbourne. Here is Biden at a campaign event trashing Japan for not taking in more immigrants. Apologies for the poor quality vision.
There's an entire move because they are xenophobic, because they do not want to invite other people from outside their country to come in and make up the workforce. They have fewer workers than they have a need for workers.
Japan's xenophobic. I think the Japanese would actually look at the US and think, are you crazy? The US has taken around 8 million illegal immigrants under Biden, but Japan, well, it takes only a couple of hundred refugees a year and severely limits immigration. But its reward seems to me to be a very low crime rate, very high social cohesion, and a high trust society, none of which you could say about the US. Joining me is Sean Spicer, the first White House spokesman of President Donald Trump. Sean Spicer, always great to talk to you. Joe Biden attacking Japan, saying it's xenophobic for not taking in more immigrants, as if the United States is the model. Do you think it's misread this issue?
Yes, 100%. Look, the thing that's so funny is that on two ways he's screwed this up. One is our own country. He's defending the fact that he doesn't have an open border, which he does. It's the number one issue driving people to the polls this year. Brand new poll out this morning from News Nation here in America showing that people are really driving to the polls this November based on the issue of immigration. So number one, he's misread it domestically here in the States in a key time for his political future. But secondly, he offended one of our greatest allies. I mean, to sit around and tell Japan that they're xenophobic when they have to worry every day about their neighbor, China. I don't really think that we should be lecturing them about their policies. I've had the honor to travel over there a few times in the past couple of years. I will take how Japan runs its country over how Joe Biden's running our country every day of the week right now. It's an amazing society. The crime is way down. They have a much better handle, put it that way, on what's going on than Joe Biden does in terms of our country.
And they seem to have a much deeper and more secure sense of what culturally they're about, whereas America right now seems particularly divided. Talking about that, in fact, Sean, these anti-Israel protests at your universities, I mean, they've been violent, they've been trashing buildings, it's just been terrible. Now you've got the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel protesters invading even graduation ceremonies, which in America, they're big things, graduation ceremonies at the universities. Where are these protests going and how are they playing out?
These privileged little brats are taking over the universities, as you said, stopping graduations. They're going in and taking over buildings. They're breaking the law. And I think that part of this is also concerning as an American, what workforce they're entering into. They have been allowed to do this through feckless leadership at the administration level of all these institutions. What worries me is these folks are now going into a workforce where this is what they think is tolerable and acceptable behavior.
Well, that's a sad indictment, given that a lot of the more dramatic protests have been at some of your top universities. So what does that say about the next generation? Sean, Donald Trump is on trial in New York. We've talked about this before, for allegedly falsifying his bookkeeping to hide payments to a porn star, Stormy Daniels, payments to pay her to keep quiet about their alleged affair. Trump says it is a political trial to keep him off the campaign trail for weeks. And the judge is now even threatening to jail him for contempt of court for not shutting up outside the court about the jurors and the trial and so on. The judge has fined him 10 times already, suggests jail is the next option. Here is Donald Trump saying, bring it on.
I have to watch every word I tell you people. You ask me a question, a simple question, I'd like to give it, but I can't talk about it. Because this judge has given me a gag order and say you'll go to jail if you violate it. And frankly, you know what? Our Constitution is much more important than jail. It's not even close. I'll do that sacrifice any day.
Well, that's Donald Trump basically daring the judge to do it, almost inviting him to do it. How would that go down?
Listen, I think that this is an amazing issue where we have come to now. The judge saying, look, clearly the fines aren't a deterrent. By the way, the interesting thing that Trump's lawyers pointed out today, Andrew, is that everything that he ruled on had happened prior to the last ruling. So he was basically saying it's not a deterrent, but everything I'm talking to you about and fining for you now occurred prior to the last time that I brought this issue up. Therefore, it would be impossible for a deterrent to take effect on something that had been retroactive. The logic and the timeline didn't make that sense. That aside, we've talked about how this case is ridiculous because it's a bookkeeping misdemeanor offense past the statute of limitations in the state of New York, number one. Number two, gag orders are not to prevent the defendant from being able to express themselves. Never mind that he is a candidate and a leading candidate for president of the United States here in the country. But the fact of the matter is that any American would have more rights than he has now to express himself. For example, the judge's daughter literally is a political fundraiser whose clients include Adam Schiff, and she sends out emails about how he should be in jail and found guilty. She makes money off of the decisions that her dad makes with respect to Donald Trump. Trump's pointed that out, and they say that he's attacking the judge's family. He is speaking out. He has a First Amendment right here in America to do so. And so I think there's a travesty on several levels. With respect to the jail time, we have come to a very scary place where the president of the United States may be jailed, not for an offense he committed, but for speaking out and exercising his First Amendment rights. That is a scary proposition. And I'll tell you this. I know Donald Trump pretty well. the idea of spending a single night in Rikers Island or anything like that is something that I get what he said there, but I can't imagine anybody, myself included, that would want to spend an hour, never mind a day, in Rikers Island or any facility that New York State operates in their penal system. So I look, this might be a good political thing for Trump in the end, because I think it would galvanize so many Americans who are on the fence and fully bring into focus the weaponization and the lawfare that has existed in this. But I just still would not wish that on anybody, even if that was the long-term outcome.
Sean Spicer, it is extraordinary what's happening in America under Joe Biden. Thank you so much for your time.
Always enjoy it. Thanks, Andrew.
After the break, Israel moves in for the kill in Gaza. I'll talk to Colonel Richard Kemp about the lies being told about the death toll. Israel's now started its attack on the final hiding place of Hamas terrorists it hasn't searched in Rafah, the very south of the Gaza Strip. The attack started with Israel dropping leaflets telling civilians there to move north to safety. But Hamas had one trick left to play as citizens fled to make Israel seem bad. Hamas announced that it agreed to a peace deal, like it was an undeal, and had Palestinians celebrating either for real or for propaganda to make Israel seem evil for rejecting a deal it hadn't actually seen. In fact, the deal was a Hamas try-on that had it keep Jewish hostages for many months more while Israel pulled out and reconstruction money poured in. A Hamas victory. But now come the Israeli attacks on Rafah. Join me is Colonel Richard Kemp, a retired British Army officer who commanded Operation Fingal in Afghanistan. He's reported a lot from Israel. He's in Australia to launch a documentary for the Australian Jewish Association, which is called Whose Land? Colonel Richard Kemp, it's great to see you again. The attack on Rafah, how do you expect it to unfold and what do you expect it to achieve?
Thank you, Andrew. It's really good to be with you. I think what we're seeing now is the preliminary moves by the IDF towards what looks like becoming a major ground and air offensive against Rafah. And the objectives, of course, of that offensive are to destroy the formed elements of Hamas which remain in Rafah, which are the main fighting components of Hamas that haven't so far been destroyed. And so ultimately, we'll obviously have to see how it works out. You can never predict how a battle or a war is going to unfold, but I would expect at the end of a campaign inside Rafah that we will see the final destruction of Hamas as a major fighting organization that threatens Israel.
Now, Colonel Kemp, there have been so many claims that Israel has been recklessly and even deliberately slaughtering civilians. Every civilian death is obviously tragic, and if only it could be avoided. But whether Israel has been reckless, I don't know. Hamas now claims that more than 34,000 Palestinians have died in this war, 70% of them women and children. I've seen statisticians actually saying that's impossibly high, that number. What do you believe? Is it 70% women and children dead among the casualties of this war?
I've been inside Gaza a few times since the war began on the ground with the IDF, and I've seen the way they fight, and they fight both from the ground and from the air with great caution, trying to everything they can to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians. And they've set up essentially an apparatus which is unseen in the Western world. No other army has achieved what the IDF have achieved in working to destroy their enemies while minimizing the deaths of the civilian population. And they've been, I believe, very, very successful. We can't, of course, believe the Hamas figure of 34,000, which I think they've also revised down to about 21,000 a week or so ago. But we can't take those figures as being authoritative. It might be that number, it might be more, it might be significantly less. We just don't know. But what we do believe, according to IDF estimates, is that they've killed something like 13 to 15,000 Hamas terrorists since the war began. If you do take the Hamas figures as being roughly accurate, but you then deduct from the overall figures, both that 15,000, 13,000, 15,000, and you deduct the people who have been killed by Hamas themselves, either by rockets dropping short, which is about 20% of all the rockets they've fired, or by deliberate murder of their own people, which they've done on a large scale, plus death by natural causes, it brings you down, in my calculation, to a figure of less than one civilian killed for every combatant, which sounds terrible, and it is terrible, but it's much, much better than the United States, Great Britain, and other allies achieved in other conflicts. For example, it was 3 civilians to 1 combatant in Iraq and 5 civilians to 1 combatant in Afghanistan. So the IDF, through extraordinary measures, I think have achieved a very impressive civilian to military casualty ratio. Although even that, you know, every death of a civilian is terrible, but it's very hard to avoid at all. It's impossible to avoid, particularly when Hamas are doing everything they can to try and maximize the deaths of innocent civilians inside Gaza.
Just one last thing, Colonel Kemp. China on the weekend dropped flares just in front of an Australian Navy helicopter in international waters off South Korea. This wasn't in Chinese waters, forcing the helicopter to take evasive action to save itself. How serious is that?
Well, I think it's a very serious act of aggression by China. But of course, we've seen numerous similar acts of aggression by China in this region. And I think it underlines, to me anyway, it underlines the importance in the bigger picture of things like the AUKUS deal with the US and the UK and Australia to try and put together a coherent alliance to try and counter Chinese aggression. I think this is obviously a single incident, but it's indicative, I think, of probably the ramping up we're going to see in over future years of Chinese aggression throughout this region, as well as elsewhere in the world. And let's not forget, going back to what we were talking about before, China's close alliance with Iran, which is behind, to a very large extent, behind the war in the Middle East, allied with Iran and with Russia. So those 3 elements of an axis of evil, you could call it, are a major problem for the Western world for the foreseeable future.
Colonel Richard Kemp, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
After the break, yet another boat of illegal immigrants arrives. Plus, we'll have a look at why a Perth imam is so wrong. We now know the identity of the 16-year-old Muslim convert who stabbed a man in the back in Perth before being shot dead by police. It is James Hollins, who left messages saying he was doing it for Allah. Now, maybe the fact that he's Caucasian, even said to be mentally ill, is why Perth Imam Mohammed Shakib said this.
This outdated game of expecting Muslims to condemn and to apologise for something which was nothing to do with them. I think just like no other faith group is expected to apologise for a crime committed by an individual just because they share the same faith, I think the Muslim community should also be afforded that same luxury. I'm
joined by my Tuesday panel, Will Kingston, host of Fire at Will, a weekly podcast from The Spectator on politics and culture, and Sky News host Danica DeGiorgio, host of Danica and James on Sky News on Sundays at 8 p.m. Will, I think the imam there is wrong. He seems a nice guy, but I agree, Muslims don't need to apologise for what someone like Hollins does, but don't Muslim leaders like him have a huge responsibility to make sure their religion is not seen to endorse such violence as it too often is?
Well, why should we expect him to say something when almost every Australian politician is too afraid to say something, Andrew? We hear a lot about Islamophobia. Yeah. We hear a bit about radical Islamism. We never hear the uncomfortable truth that there are a large amount of mainstream Muslims that hold views that are counter to a Western liberal democracy. Now, I haven't been able to find recent Australian data because the universities are too afraid to have this conversation. But take the UK, where only a quarter of British Muslims think that Hamas committed rape and murder on October 7. A third of British Muslims think that Sharia law should be introduced in the UK. 1/3. These aren't the extremist fringe. This is a large amount of people, and it's a number of people that's going to get bigger in Australia and the UK as the demographics change over the next 50 years. So sure, Muslims have a responsibility, but we need to have this conversation more broadly, and we need to stop being so afraid of it.
Danica?
I completely agree. Muslim leaders do have a big responsibility, Andrew, not just, as you said, to ensure that their religion does not endorse violence, but also to denounce any and all acts of Islamic extremism and terrorism, but also to call out and report anybody within their mosques or their youth centres that is going down this path of radicalisation. And what we haven't really seen from Muslim leaders in this country, not from all, but from many, is a refusal to call out Islamic extremism, just like they haven't been calling out hate preachers. For example, in this latest incident, as that 16-year-old boy, there was one imam in Perth who palmed it off as a mental health incident. And while I'm sure that is the case, the reality is this kid was radicalised. And this same imam, Andrew, also came out yesterday and told reporters that the community is concerned about Islamophobia. Well, it's that same rhetoric we hear every time. We saw it last month during the alleged terror attack in the aftermath of the Lindt Cafe siege, where suddenly we've got to tiptoe around it. We're not allowed to say anything. We've got to tread carefully because it's Islamophobia. The reality is it's not. We need to have an open and frank conversation about this, and I really believe that Muslim leaders do have a role to play here.
Well, I do think by denouncing it, it's not just to, reassure non-Muslim Australians, it's also to set an example to their own community. This is not what Islam stands for. That's the whole reason for denunciation. But Will, yet another boatload of illegal boat people has arrived. 5 men who came via Indonesia and PNG to the Torres Strait. They're reportedly Africans from Senegal, so they've come a very long way. So this means 3 boats have landed on the mainland so far, 1 in the Torres Strait, in the last 6 months. That's not many, but I do now detect a pattern. But why?
Because the Labor Party is forever searching for this holy grail of appearing kind and compassionate whilst having strong borders, and it's often mutually incompatible. This is something which the Liberals have intrinsically understood since Howard, and it's something that the Labor Party just doesn't get, that being forceful, that having a nasty deterrent is part of having a strong border. And the rhetoric is just as important as the policy settings. So most of the policy settings remain the same, but the Labor Party have eased off on the rhetoric around the deterrent, and that opens up the door. It's going to be a big problem for Labor if these numbers continue to go up over the next 12 months.
Danica?
Well, Andrew, here we go again. The ghosts of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years are circling this government once again because they have simply these people smugglers have detected holes and gaps within Albanese's government, and they're testing his resolve because now we've seen a few boats arrive undetected this year. And, we've got a problem when one boat in particular came in February off the coast of Western Australia, and it was undetected by authorities, yet a group of Aboriginals, including one with a drone from JB Hi-Fi, managed to detect the boat and managed to pinpoint the location of these arrivals and alert authorities. That's when you've got a problem. We know that people smugglers, news travels fast with them. So here we go again, and hopefully we do not have a repeat of what we saw many years ago.
Well, if only our military just shopped at JB Hi-Fi as well. They wouldn't need multi-billion-dollar budgets. They might stop a few boats. Will Kingston, Danica DiGiorgio, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Well, that's it from me. Coming up next, after a terrific interview last night with Josh Frydenberg, is Sharri Markson. But from me, good night.